Before we kick off the show, if you're a fan of History Hack, please do what you can to support the show. We completely get that not everyone is able or willing to dig into their pockets. Times are hard, but by dropping a like, subscribing on Twitter and YouTube, and importantly, leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, you can help the programme grow and reach more people. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, go to patreon.com/historyhack, where you'll find perks from secret Facebook groups to early release material. If you just want to leave us a one-off tip, go to ko-fi.com/historyhack. The links are in the description. And whatever form your kind support takes, know that we are massively grateful. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to today's instalment of History Hack. We've got a really interesting story for you today. This book is taking the book world by storm, really, isn't it, Zach?
It is. We have someone who feels, frankly, from the conversation we've had with them over the last quarter of an hour, like they were just made for History Hack, to be honest with you. E Rooks is joining us. She's the author of The Black Joke, the true story of one ship's battle against the slave trade, which, as you say, has done incredibly well. It's had snippets on ABC News, amongst other things, so we're very honoured to have her here with us today. Rooks is obviously working on the field of transatlantic slave trade, but previously has written Between the Briefs, for which she won 2 national awards for sex-positive journalism. And I gather that there is another book incoming on that. And we've been discussing already about how we can kind of draw on your work on sort of the history surrounding all of that. Rooks, welcome to History Hack. Great to meet you. How are you doing?
Doing well. And my dog Bill would apparently also like to say hello. Oh, really? 20 minutes we went and not one bark.
I love it. Well, Bill can join in whenever he likes, but I have to ask you before we start the questions that we actually sent you. How did you get from sex to boats?
No, I feel like that instinct is sound, right? I think that is an easy connection to make. I wish it were how I got here. But no, I was actually writing, I was working on a different project involving sort of race and gender and activism in the United States. And I happened to be reading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Suppression of the Atlantic Slave Trade, which was his dissertation at Harvard in like 1894. It's amazing. It's filled with like amazing stats and like lists of all these legislative acts. It's just a really, really good compendium of information. And in there, he was talking about a suppression squadron. I'm like, a who squadron? Because I like to think of myself as someone who's pretty familiar with American history, particularly in the context of like race and gender, and especially sex, right? But I had never heard of the idea of there being a squadron that was actively suppressing the slave trade from the United States or from the UK or anything. And then, you know, several rabbit holes later, here we are, because it was one of those stories where I was surprised I had never heard about this, you know, as someone who is like a consumer of a lot of history books and that kind of thing. I like to read all sorts of stuff. And in this particular case, it seemed like one of those stories that people should hear about, you know, like I wanted to rectify my lack of information and also kind of everyone else's at the same time.
So let's start to dig. This story is perhaps going to surprise people when we consider the origins of this ship. So Black Joke, how does it start life?
So it begins as it's a Baltimore Clipper, or a proto-Baltimore Clipper, let's say, which is to say a purpose-built slaving vessel. It was built in the Americas, we can presume, because that's where the best sort of shipping of this type was coming from, hence the Baltimore and Baltimore Clipper. And the only like ship that is known to have been built along these sort of similar specifications at this time was built in 1825 for Pedro I of Brazil. And it was originally called the Griffin. So we don't know what happens to the Griffin, but within a couple of years, by 1826, 27, you see the Henriqueta on the water. And Henriqueta is owned by a prominent Brazilian slave trader who owns a fleet of slaving vessels and has 6 successful runs before the one where it gets captured and where the ship becomes the Black Joke due to the Royal Navy's intervention.
So is this custom built for the slave trade? Is this designed with the slave trade in mind, or is it just designed to be a very fast ship that can transport from whatever people might want to transport from X to Y?
Yeah, no, it is absolutely custom built for the slave trade specifically. And people would go a step further. Some ships for the slave trade were not only built for that purpose, so with a slave deck and sort of other accoutrements that would be sort of necessary to the trade, but also with the specific route in mind. If this ship was intended to travel from a certain coast almost all of them are coming from the slave coast in this particular story. But if a ship were destined to travel from, say, Lagos or the Bight of Benin or something like that to Havana versus Rio, it would be built to best sort of navigate the sea issues that it might encounter on the way, right? Various currents, storms, how long it would be on the water, etc. So when they say purpose-built, they mean literally purpose-built specifically for the slave trade, for this slave route, if folks had enough money to do so.
And it goes without saying, all of these ships are horrific in terms of the conditions on board them. But there is, and I'll be honest, I'm not a historian of the slave trade, but I have heard through some folks, and I don't know if this story is true, that there were some ships that were slightly, and obviously all things are relative, but slightly better in terms of sanitary conditions, because some people recognized that actually if you pack hundreds of people into a vessel versus if, packing fewer people in, actually you've got a better chance of these people surviving the journey across. So where does this, firstly, is that perception correct? And also, if so, where does this ship kind of sit along that line?
I'd say yes, sort of. That perception is correct. And I think mostly it's dependent on the individuals involved, right? Like one of the sources I encountered doing this was a book that was out recently called, I want to say, The Yellow Demon of Fever by Manuel Barcia, whomever you are, Barcia. I can spell it. But where they were discussing sort of like the knowledge that was shared amongst sort of doctors and medical professionals who would often be on slaving vessels, not all slaving vessels. There was at least one nationality that was reputed for not having them, but there were frequently doctors on board because the idea was to not, maximize life because life has value, but to maximize life because life has profit. And then you also get like the flip side of that, where you have ships where there was an example that sort of predates the Black Joke's time, wherein one enterprising captain, realizing that they had been sort of at sea for a minute and he would not have enough stores, decided to simply chuck a third of the enslaved people on board into the ocean for the insurance, because then at least he would sort of make the profits back on the journey, which, by the way, was not a successful claim. But yeah, so you really have a variation there. Where Henrietta fits is a little bit more difficult to ascertain because one, we know the ship was incredibly small and overpacked. We know that. So we can't say that it's like, a lower density of people because in that particular instance, we know that they were violating Portuguese law in order to put that many people on the ship in the first place. We know that the slave deck was short, comparatively speaking. It could be between anywhere from 2+ feet to less than 5 feet. And I want to say Black Joke's was somewhere between 3 and 4. And the shortest that they ever encounter in the book, I want to say, is on the Primero, which was either 3 or just under 3 feet tall. So
it is like the stuff nightmares are made of, isn't it?
Absolutely.
This is a heinous vessel built to capitalize on human misery so that other humans can make a profit out of it. Do you know anything about the men that worked on her?
We do, somewhat. And it's one of those situations where sort of the more well-off they were, or the higher ranking they were, the more we know about them. Shocking. So we definitely know a ton about the various commodores of the West Africa Squadron, which is what the Black Joke was a part of. When it comes to the actual commanders of the ship, it starts to vary. Some of them we know more about, like the first 2, Turner and Downs, or the last 2, Ramsey and Huntley. The 2 in the middle, on the other hand, that's where things tend to get a little bit less informative. And part of that is relations, part of that is promotions, part of that is what their career ended up being or what it had been before, because it's such a weird period of history. So if they had had a lot going on, like Downs and the African during the Napoleonic Wars, well, then we know a lot more about his situation than we might otherwise know.
The ship's eventually captured. I'm curious about the process behind that happening, because part of the point about this ship, as you say, custom built in an era when the Royal Navy is taking a more active role in trying to prohibit the slave trade. So she has a reputation for being quite a speedy vessel because she's designed to be able to outrun, some of the Navy frigates and men of war. So how does she end up being captured?
I'm sorry, I'm gonna need you to repeat the question because I
That's
just
fine.
got distracted by my dog.
No worries.
And I'm trying to text someone to please come deal with him. So because I love him, but I need him to stop talking now. So if you could repeat that for me, that would be great.
It's absolutely fine. So the ship is eventually captured. I'm curious about this because you were talking earlier about how these ships are custom built, right? And this is an era in which the ship is built where the Royal Navy is taking a growing role in trying to police the slave trade and trying to restrict the transport of people across the Atlantic, which therefore means these ships now absolutely have to be built for speed to be able to outrun the Navy.
Right.
So how does she end up being captured? Because she has a reputation for being quite a fast ship, doesn't she? That's part of the point of her.
Yeah. Absolutely. Basically, overconfidence seems to be the answer. And a lot of places where it seems like, from what I have learned, where British shipping may not have been well suited to this particular task because they just come out of obviously Napoleonic Wars. This is not a ships of the line kind of moment. However, so there's sort of this transition point. It's also the end of the age of sail, and we're getting into those metal ships, right? So there's this other transition point happening. But at the time when the capture happens, we have a fifth-rate frigate against a purpose-built slaver. You'd think there's no way. But the skill barrier was huge. And so at some point, the fact that British sailors were both exceptionally well trained and very, very experienced compared to many of their foreign counterparts, especially people who are in merchant side of things, not necessarily, per se war side of things, although obviously there was a lot of overlap there. So when you get into a situation like that, you have the captain of the Henrietta decides that he can, instead of just making a straight break for it, he tries to cut across the Sybil to make a break for it. And that was all she wrote. The gunnery on the Sybil was really solid and they were able to take the ship. And it wasn't the first time the Henrietta had almost gotten captured. It had previously almost gotten captured by Bullen's Maidstone. But that time they weren't found, I believe, with any enslaved people on board. So they had to be released.
You say the gunnery was really good. We're talking about firing directly on the ship with people on board?
No, and thank you for clarifying that point.
Okay.
We're definitely not talking about that. The goal was usually to aim into the rigging, so to disable a ship without killing the enslaved people on board in particular. There was less concerned for the crew. For obvious
thank Christ for that. I just had going, no, they just fired right at it.
Right, exactly. And we have one example that I know of in this book where a captain elects to fire directly into a ship, and his rationale for that was that a sea tornado, we don't know if that's just a large storm or an actual tornado, was approaching, and so the choice was sort of either fire into the ship or allow the ship to escape, he felt. So he made a choice, which I believe ended up killing at least 11 enslaved people, as well as several people, again, in the crew, but thus ever to slavers. So.
Do we know what happened to the slaves that were on board when it was taken off the arseholes running it, is what I want to say.
Right. We do. up until a point, right? So once a ship gets captured, you end up in a situation where it's now a prize ship. So a small detachment of the capturing vessel would board it, wrangle not just the now captive crew, but all of the enslaved people who are currently on board, and then get it back to Freetown, which, due to the currents in that particular area, could make what would have been going the opposite direction, a 3-4 day trip coming back up, a 3-week trip potentially. So there was a lot of potential for shenanigans and strife in the context of the prize crew as well. Then when they arrive at the closest mixed commission court, which in this case would be Freetown in Sierra Leone. However, there's also one in Rio, and there was also one in Havana, and there was also one in Suriname. So basically each sort of competing major power, imperial power, right, it sort of had their own mixed commission court with Britain as the anchoring point for all of them. So you get to the court in Freetown, which for a long time had only British commissioners because no one else wanted to serve in Freetown, and thus had more convictions. How'd that happen? So they get there, and the enslaved folks are usually made to wait until they can be sort of cataloged into the liberated African department, at which point they have approximately 3 choices. They could have already died at this point. A fifth of people might have died by this point. And they could have already rebelled at this point, in which case they might have been sent out of the colony. But the other choices were choices is in really big scare quotes for folks who couldn't see me do that. But the other choices were they could be assigned to if they were men, they could be assigned to a segregated unit of the Royal Marines stationed in Africa. B, the most common option was that they could be made to essentially farm, to create products to sustain the colony and sort of make it into a viable economic trading partner with those around it and with metropoles and whatnot across the ocean. Or C, they could be sent as apprentices to Jamaica or other British holdings in the West Indies to grow sugar. Is that exactly what they were about to be doing before they were liberated? Weird. And those terms were not to exceed 14 years, but did they readily and frequently exceed 14 years and essentially become a different form of lifelong servitude? Yeah, of course they did. So the choices were not great. Liberation was not real. They were clearly sort of subject to the British crown in some way, shape, or form. It was not sort of simply a question of being liberated and then regaining one's freedom of movement and ability to make choices for oneself and go where one will. That was not the situation.
Can I ask if the people that were captured running it, were they subject to any kind of punishment?
I wish I had a better answer for you, but the answer really is not really. They were legally supposed to be subject to some sort of punishment, but the frequency of that happening was basically never. Like oftentimes people would be brought with the ship, right? The crew would come in with the ship because they also had to testify in regards to what its purpose had been, which could, end up with some, interesting legal proceedings that were not as straightforward as one might think. But usually afterwards, they were just sort of let go, and they could go get another commission. They might act as, they probably wouldn't, but they could facilitate someone else acting as an agent for the actual owner and simply purchase other ships at auction that had been seized because the Royal Navy had no policy on how they were resold. And to whom beyond they couldn't obviously be sold to a slaver, but if one exercised proxies, they were very much resold to slavers. So you end up in a situation where you have the Black Joke and other ships in the squadron catching the exact same ship under multiple names, 2, 3, 4 times. And you have situations where people know that someone is acting as an agent, even British citizens acting as agents of enslavers in Brazil and whatnot. And nonetheless, despite multiple protestations, we have a record of Collier writing blistering letters about what's going on here. And for a variety of reasons that mostly we can only speculate on, the Admiralty decided that this just wasn't a big enough problem to deal with until, I believe, I could be wrong here, so people don't beat me up, but I want to say it was 1836, where they finally promulgated a rule about the disposition of slave ships. But whether or not, like, people getting punished, nah. Like, they were, even at one point, the law was changed so that all slavers were technically pirates. So the law of piracy should have applied to them. And they still didn't get punished in the same way as an quote unquote actual pirate, as opposed to a slaver come pirate would have been punished. So
do you think it's a problem with exercising British law over non-British people, and that's why they're so faffy about it?
I do think that's a big part of it. I mean, one could assert that if they were, being more stringent, they could have at least exercised it better over British citizens, which was sporadic at best.
Like, it's half-cocked. You're going to go out and tell the world they can't do this, but you're not going to back it up. That's what it feels like.
And I think that's why a lot of the world was initially quite suspicious of British motivations, right? A lot of folks, particularly folks doing diplomatic work in, say, Spain and Portugal, were very like, Britain, I feel like what you're trying to accomplish here has nothing to do with ending the slave trade. And that was a big thing that came up when the ability to sort of police the seas in this way was being debated in some ways at the Congress of Vienna, which is to say, there was a discussion of, if Britain cares so much about slavery and piracy, why don't they do anything about the Barbary pirates? And so, even though comparatively speaking, much smaller problem with nowhere near the same level of sort of, I guess, industrial scale humanitarian crisis, let's put it that way, nonetheless, it was sort of taken that there needed to be some sort of act of good faith by some people who were treating with Britain in order to believe that this policing of the seas was anything more than just that, an ability to get on other folks' boats and do something about it. And that's part of the reason that the United States and France were both like, absolutely not. We have no interest in this plan. There will be no right of search. No, thank you. Because I know y'all don't call it the War of 1812, but we do. And, one of the rallying cries had just been sort of the impressment of American sailors and whatnot. They're not going to let British people on their own ships 15 years later. That's not going to happen. And France, in a similar fashion, was very like, didn't we just finish fighting a war with you? If you want it, we don't. Like, that's no. The answer is always no. We don't trust you for anything. Portugal and Spain were more susceptible to monetary inducement. So basically, Britain paid them multiple times to get right of search treaties that then were renegotiated multiple times and then eventually had to incorporate Brazil or not incorporate Brazil, and then be sort of separately decided as all of these revolutions in South America are taking place during all of this.
There's also a point here that, it's basic. They're using these, inverted commas, liberated, but really not liberated slaves as indentured labor. I mean, this thing about let's give you the option to go serve in the Royal Marines, that's a version of what the British were doing when they were trading in slaves before the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, when slave ships arrived in the West Indies, and they basically took the best men that were on board these ships and pressed them. They had no choice, pressed them into the British Army. So it's all just a continuation of the same thing. So it's not any better.
It's minimally better, to be sure. And it's interesting because one question I have gotten a couple of times is, what makes you believe that Britain could have, that there was a better way to do this besides obviously the situation of this ship, right? Because I think Black Joke in and of itself reveals that there was potentially a more effective way to do this. But the most revealing thing is that after, in the 1840s, when the commitment got really real, then suddenly within a decade, you have the sort of international slave trade on the industrial scale mostly extinguished. Right. So once the commitment is pretty hardcore and the buy-in, obviously from other powers, is either has been forced or procured or negotiated, depending on who those other powers were, then suddenly, well, actually, it can be done, and it could actually be done pretty fast. So what folks are going through in this sort of period over the 1820s and 30s just looks even more sort of unnecessary and futile when you just look 20 years, 30 years in the future.
I know we're going off at a massive tangent, but I just want to keep asking these questions. Do you think part of the reason for that slow shift and the sort of almost the dragging of feet is because actually Britain as a country is dragging its feet on this idea of abolition wholesale? I'm sure they've abolished the slave trade, but when you look at the discussions that are going on around abolishing slavery as an institution, everybody's going, well, but how do we compensate the owners of slaves? And, you know, can the economy survive if we completely abolish slavery? This needs to be done slowly, and we need to take our time and consider things. You know, all of these, what we now think of as incredibly, rightly, incredibly insidious arguments, but these are our mainstream views at the time. Is that part of the reason why it takes a while for this shift to happen until the 1830s, when, of course, this is appalling, is it 1833 that we finally abolished slavery properly? Or is it 1832?
There's an interesting, I think the argument would be made 1833 or 1834. But then I think the Slave Compensation Act that you referenced, I want to say it's 1837. Everything in me is like, my inner reference librarian is, I really want to go look this up right now. Because it's bothering me to not have the exact date. But yes, so post Black Joke being burned and sort of decommissioned or whatever in 1832, then you have a couple of things happen, right? Victoria comes to the throne, so that's going to change some stuff. 3 days with Louis Philippe in France, just in like 1830 and whatnot. And so there's a lot of shift in sort of going from, in France's case, an ultra conservative, monarchy to a comparatively liberal, monarchy. And then in England at the same time, you also have a shift with the whole big thing where Labour sort of has their big moment, I guess. And then, so you have a shift in who's running the Admiralty. However, part of the problem, it becomes that the monarch, though, at this point is William IV, right? Your Sailor King. And he was not a fan of ending the slave trade. As the Duke of Clarence, he spoke against it in Parliament back in the day. So to imagine that this is the person who's going to really have like the drive and impetus to get this program into the place where it needs to be in order to be effective that is not the monarch we were looking for, right? For that solution. And yeah, people were super, super divided. The battle in the United States, it's really strange because people do not expect it. But in the United States, outlawing the international slave trade was easy peasy, lemon squeezy. The federal government was totally behind it. Thomas Jefferson gave a speech in 1806 that was like, we need to end this violation of human rights, which incredible side eye, but okay. Jefferson, yeah, sure do.
We own at that point.
Several hundred at minimum. That's not including his arguably teenage mistress, right? I don't know Sally Hemings' exact age in 1806, but still. And so you end up with a situation where the political will is like, yeah, we should end it. And then you end up with an underground international slave import market that continues for several decades, and an extraordinarily robust domestic slave trade market that is happening in the United States. And in Britain, one, those things weren't necessarily as accessible as options because of geography, but also two, the battle to end the slave trade was comparatively much more ground up. And it makes sense that because the United States imported comparatively few enslaved people compared to Britain, who was the biggest player in the slave trade at that time. And also, I've seen some figures quoted where as much as 10% or possibly more of the British economy was dependent on slavery. at this juncture. So the argument that it could impact the economy is quite strong. It really could impact the economy. Should that matter? No, but it was nonetheless the argument, you know? And I think that a lot of that sort of impetus for let's get this passed and change things sort of dissipated once it was clear that it was going to be really, really difficult and really, really fraught, because it seems like a number of people working on this issue felt that this is going to be, you know, once it was outlawed, everybody would see it. It would be a matter of a couple of years. There would be no more slave trade. We'd move on to slavery. Boom, bam, done. And that's just not what happened. And I think looking back in hindsight, it's easier to say that that was grossly optimistic. I don't know how it would have felt at the time, but.
Right, should we get on to the bit where this boat redeems itself?
Yeah, why not?
Why this story has caught people's imaginations, I think. So this boat, which has created untold misery, is captured, repurposed, and now is a slave ship hunter. Boom. Yeah. Why did they decide to do this?
Well, so Bullen, not Collier, the previous Commodore of the squadron before the time period we're dealing with, had actually sort of started this practice where tenders were a thing. Let's be clear, right? So tenders are a thing. Tenders are still a thing. They're just ships that exist to help sort of service the parent vessel, right? For lack of a more complex way to put it. And at that time, then, Bullen has the idea that if a tender is essentially part of its parent vessel, right, for all legal arguments, then anything done by a tender is, for all legal arguments, done by the parent vessel. Okay, which means that even without its own copies of the treaties that sort of enabled this right of search, which all ships who were doing this had to have, a tender should be able to capture a slave ship and have it still sort of count under the umbrella of the captures of the parent ship, right? So in this case, Black Joke was tender to the flagship of the squadron as a general rule, which was first the Sybil, then briefly the Athol, while Gordon was interim commander, and then finally the Dryad under John Hayes, right? And so Bullen is like, well, let's give this a shot. So he tries it. He captures a ship. It works because using a repurposed slave ship as a tender, which folks were already doing because you could get them for cheap at auction, was surprisingly effective in capturing other slave ships. Should it have been surprising? No, but it was. So eventually Canning actually has to weigh in on whether or not this is legal. And they sort of, do their little research behind the scenes and decide it seems like that hamstringing people on a legal question that nobody was asking seems unnecessary. So the policy becomes, yeah, it's okay. You can use tenders this way, but let's give them their own copies of the treaties, just in case. And so once that system's in place, Bullen sort of had initiated, and then Collier runs with it. The Black Joke does not end up being his only tender. He had at least 3 more. We know that Hayes had several. We know that the final Commodore that we sort of treat with in the book, Warren, brought ships down with him. Hayes had brought one down with him as well as his own. So it wasn't uncommon. The thing was, though, is that you also had to buy them yourself. In the case of the West Africa Squadron, which definitely changed their use.
How successful was she then? I mean, all these things are relative, but in terms of that effort to limit slavery, what does she actually end up achieving? Because you talk about how there's a sort of relatively fond memory of Black Joke prior to her burning.
And there is. To say that Black Joke turned the international reputation around, I think, would be an understatement. And practically speaking, right, because one thing that was brought up earlier had led, sort of over 3,000 people into misery, is also recorded as having, quote unquote, liberated over 3,000 people from the slave trade. So even at the moment of burning, if you want to talk in literal human lives on that ship impacted, we might be at sort of a net zero almost, is that it made up the bad it did, but not potentially much more. However, its international reputation cannot be understated here, because I read one great dissertation that was talking about sort of the deployment issues and whatnot, and discussed that basically, who's it by? Dave Blair, and discussed that the ship itself had what was called a Batman effect, essentially, where in other ships, other slaving vessels would avoid Black Joke's patrolling area because they were more likely to get caught by that ship. So it created a sort of chilling effect zone around itself, because there were ships that would literally stay in harbor. If they knew that Black Joke was in the bights, they would stay in harbor for weeks or months and wait for Black Joke to be gone before then embarking enslaved people and heading back to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So in that case, it had a massive impact. And I think one of the sort of most interesting quotes, and I use it, at least I think I use it in the beginning, at the end, is from a guy who wrote a book who was serving on Black Joke as a lieutenant from the Dryad, Peter Leonard. And he says that essentially that this is a decision to burn the ship, is a decision that will be toasted from Havana to Ouida to everywhere in between, essentially asserting that slave traders were going to be ecstatic that they didn't have to worry about this ship anymore, which I think speaks to what it accomplished beyond the actual numbers. But from an actual numbers perspective, drop in the bucket, honestly. Like we have to be real about that. This is a drop in the bucket.
I have to ask, what's its name throughout? Is it always the Black Joke?
Post Henrietta, it is always the Black Joke. And it's one of those names where it seems very particularly sort of pointed and interesting now. Yeah. But we don't know if that's what Collier meant by that. And we especially don't know if that's what Collier meant by that, because Black Joke was a very popular body jig from at least the 17th century, and would go on to have a subsequent life heading towards the American musical. I had a really interesting conversation about that. But essentially, the lyric of the song is, she showed him her black joke and her belly so white. So when we look up what that means in sort of old dictionaries of slang, it says see the monosyllable. So that's intriguing. And what one is led to believe, it is a 4-letter word for a part of anatomy traditionally associated with women that I am not going to say. Because I'm guessing it's the one that starts with C, not the one that starts with T, but really, communication was achieved. We all know what he was talking about. Yeah. So, and it was a popular song with sailors in particular. So, and this wasn't the first Black Joke, it was the third associated with the Royal Navy. The previous ones, I believe, had also been tenders. So it wasn't a weird name per se, but it also, I think, has become even more loaded with historical hindsight than it was at the time.
How does she end up burning then?
Well, this is the part. If you really, really, really like the Admiralty, turn it off now. Because the answer is the ship isn't captured. The ship isn't sort of destroyed in battle in a glorious, like, sort of victory or Pyrrhic victory even. No, what essentially happens is Black Joke is rebuilt, or not rebuilt, sort of repaired several times. And at one point they had said that her timbers were rotted and a sample was sent back to the Admiralty. Problem being that when Warren actually came down to replace Hayes and decided to test the Black Joke sailing, at this point we're on the final captain, Huntley. And so Huntley brings the ship out, they have a sailing run. The trial is unequivocal. Black Joke sails rings around the ships that Warren brought with him, which were the product of sort of, the best efforts of English shipbuilding design at this time. So nobody liked that. And as a result, the Black Joke captures one more ship And there was an opportunity to potentially have it put into service for the colony. Governor Findlay, who is not my favorite historical figure, did ask for it, and he was denied. There was the possibility of it being purchased by formerly enslaved people, free Africans in both Sierra Leone and also from Fernando Po. Crowds of people had approached Hayes in various places, asking him not to burn it. There are reports of weeping, people like touching him, grabbing, please don't burn the ship. Please don't burn the ship. We'll buy it ourselves. We've collected the money. Don't burn the ship. And Hayes did not want to. Hayes is a guy who loves ships, who is deeply involved in shipbuilding and design. His uncle was a dock master. Like, he just doesn't want to do it. And for unknown reasons, Warren orders Hayes to burn the ship. And he says it's completely worn out. There's no point. He does not report the results of the sailing trial to the Admiralty, and he burns it. And that's it. So it sort of reaches this really sort of anticlimactic end that I think speaks to exactly what a lot of the problems that prevented it from being more effective were.
It sounds like a bit of a black joke.
Oh, bringing it back.
How unique is this story? You know, are there equivalent stories out there that are perhaps waiting to be discovered or that have been told before? Where can people kind of perhaps find out a little bit more about similar efforts in this field?
I would say it's both incredibly unique in the sense of just a lot of factors sort of combined to make the Black Joke's particular moment what it was. But beyond that, it's also not exactly unique. One of the only surviving sort of ship diagrams of a slaving vessel that we have today is from a vessel that Black Joke captured that was originally called Dos Amigos and then renamed Fair Rosamond. And towards the end of Black Joke's career, they sailed together because folks were worried about Black Joke's sea hardiness. And so in that sense, right, there's another example right there. Here's a ship, was captured, did much of the same work, actually got documented, this time had the lines removed so they could actually document the way the ship was built and whatnot, was exceptionally fast, and did actually a number of the same routes, but it did never, to my knowledge at least, it never had the same fame. And I would be hard pressed to name an equally famous ship from the West Africa Squadron in particular, or even from the suppression efforts more broadly. And I'm sure there might be ones that exist, but not sure. When it comes to beyond the British, there was an American suppression squadron. They didn't do much. And there was also a French suppression squadron eventually. And then there was also the sort of pirate question, because although I would say one of the biggest takeaways I've had from this project is that pirates were generally assholes, which I sort of knew, but it really brought it home in a variety of
lovable Jack Sparrow.
Right. It's like we were lied to.
Yeah.
We were lied to about delightful pirates. But there were some pirating vessels. I read about this in Reidecker and Leinbaugh's Many-Headed Hydra, which is about sort of Atlantic maritime communities, and I want to say the 18th century mostly, but where there were some pirate ships who would actively, purposefully capture slaving vessels, free the enslaved people, kill the crew, and steal the ship and call it a day, right? So people's political feelings about this sort of, I think, impacted their actions towards it. Because if you wanted to look to the other side of that coin, right, we know from Hugh Thomas's The Slave Trade that there were multiple people who were involved in either the trade itself, right? So Kearney in Gallinas, who was a British officer in, I want to say, the army, who then participates in the slave trade. And we know from Wills's Invoice of Abolition that there were people who were literally in the squadron, saw all of the sort of destruction and death and terribleness, and said, I know what I'll do when I retire, that. So you can sort of look at it from the question of people who wanted to follow in those footsteps, and also from the question of people who didn't.
Wow.
Yeah.
You've been absolutely amazing. I can see why, like, your enthusiasm for the subject and what you've learned, and that is infectious, and I can see why this book is flying right now. You absolutely deserve it. It is called The Black Joke. It is out now. Don't buy it from Jeff Bezos, because Zach will tell you he's a dick and he'll just spend the money on rocket fuel. Buy it from bookshop.org, because then History Hack gets a cut, Rooks gets a cut, and small bookshops get a cut as well, and Jeff Bezos gets nothing. Nothing.
That's a win-win-win.
Winning all the way around.
Win.
And Zach has already put your name down. He's absolutely going to harass you about coming back to talk about a history of sex.
I love it. This was a great time.
We are absolutely going to rant the hell out of going backwards in sex legislation and just pretending people don't exist and that abortion is bad.
I cannot wait for this glorious day. And then, and you know what? We can even bring in stuff from this. People are like, but people didn't have ready contraception. Actually, enslaved people used to use cotton bark tea in order to do contraception in both Africa, and then they weren't enslaved in Africa, but then they brought the tradition to the United States. So secretly they did. There were plantations where people didn't have kids for 20 years.
Yep. Boom. Let's blow their minds. We will do it.
I know. See, you can't get me started about talking about sex. It'll be over. Sex and boats. No.
Oh, outstanding, Rooks. Thank you so much.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great book.